I still remember the exact moment I realized the woman I had trusted with my home, my daughter, and my deepest grief was the same woman who had been systematically destroying my life from the inside out. I was standing in my kitchen, the one she had cleaned 1,000 times, holding a folder of documents that made my hands shake so violently I could barely read the words printed on them. My heart wasn't just broken, it was shattered into pieces so small I wasn't sure I would ever find them all again. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I got to that moment, I need to take you back to the beginning, to the day my world first fell apart, and to the day I unknowingly invited my enemy into what was left of it. My name is Rebecca Thornton, though everyone calls me Becca. 3 years ago, I was a woman who thought she had it all. I was married to Daniel, the love of my life since university, and together we had built something beautiful. He was an entrepreneur who had started a tech company in Boston that had grown beyond our wildest dreams. We lived in a gorgeous colonial home in Brookline, Massachusetts, the kind of house I had dreamed about as a little girl growing up in a cramped apartment with my single mother. We had a daughter named Sophie, who was 5 at the time, with her father's bright eyes and my stubborn streak. I worked part-time as an interior designer, more for passion than necessity, because Daniel's success meant I had the luxury of choosing my projects carefully. We were happy, genuinely, deeply, boringly happy. The kind of happy that makes other people roll their eyes at dinner parties because you can't stop touching each other's hands across the table. And then, on a Tuesday morning in March, everything changed. Daniel had left early for a meeting in New York. He kissed me goodbye while I was still half asleep, whispered that he loved me, and told me he'd be home by dinner. Those were the last words he ever said to me. 3 hours later, I received a phone call from a state trooper in Connecticut telling me that my husband's car had crossed the median on I-95 and collided with a tractor trailer. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Just like that, in the time it took for me to drop Sophie off at kindergarten and return home with my coffee, I became a widow at 31 years old. The months that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements, legal paperwork, and a grief so consuming that some days I forgot to eat, forgot to shower, forgot that I was still alive when the person I loved most in this world was not. Sophie saved me. Her little face, her constant need for breakfast and bedtime stories, and someone to hold her when she cried for her daddy, forced me to keep moving forward even when I wanted to crawl into bed and never get up again. But I was drowning. The house that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a mausoleum, too big and too quiet, every corner holding a memory of Daniel that I couldn't escape. Daniel's business partner, a man named Gregory Walsh, helped me navigate the financial aftermath. Daniel had been smart about money. He had life insurance policies worth several $1,000,000, and his share of the company was sold back to Gregory and the other partners for a sum that ensured Sophie and I would never have to worry about money again. By the time everything was settled, I had nearly $12 million in various accounts and investments, plus a house that was fully paid off. I was set for life, and I was completely, utterly alone. It was my mother-in-law, Patricia, who first suggested I hire help. She lived in Florida and couldn't be with us as often as she wanted, and she worried about me constantly. "You need someone to help with the house," she told me during one of our weekly phone calls. "Someone to take some of the burden off your shoulders so you can focus on healing and on Sophie. You can afford it, Becca. Let someone help you." I resisted at first. The idea of a stranger in my home, touching my things, being in the spaces that still smelled like Daniel, felt like an invasion. But as the months wore on, and I found myself crying on the laundry room floor because I couldn't remember the last time I had washed the sheets, I realized Patricia was right. I needed help, and that's when I found Maria. She came through an agency called Premier Home Services, which specialized in placing domestic workers with high-net-worth families in the Boston area. I remember sitting in my living room across from the agency's representative, a polished woman named Jennifer, flipping through profiles of potential housekeepers. Most of them were younger women from various backgrounds, but one profile caught my eye immediately. Maria Santos, 42 years old, originally from the Philippines but a U.S. citizen for over 15 years. She had worked for a family in Newton for 8 years before they relocated to London, and her references were glowing. The mother of that family had written a letter describing Maria as not just an employee but a member of our family, and the most trustworthy, hardworking, and kind person I have ever had the privilege of knowing. Something about Maria's photo drew me in. She had a warm face with deep brown eyes that seemed to hold a gentle understanding. Jennifer told me that Maria was looking for a long-term position with a family, that she valued stability and genuine connection over simply collecting a paycheck. She had never married, had no children of her own, and considered her work families to be her family. At the time, this seemed perfect. I was so desperate for someone who would understand the delicate ecosystem of grief I was living in. Someone who wouldn't just see my house as a job, but would treat my daughter and me with genuine care. The interview was scheduled for the following Thursday. Maria arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in neat slacks and a modest blouse, her graying black hair pulled back in a practical bun. She shook my hand with both of hers, looked into my eyes and said, "Mrs. Thornton, I am so sorry for your loss. I can see the weight you carry. I want you to know that if you choose me, I will do everything in my power to lighten that weight." I nearly cried right there in the foyer. No one had spoken to me with such simple, direct compassion in months. Everyone else tiptoed around my grief, either avoiding the subject of Daniel entirely or smothering me with platitudes that felt hollow. Maria's words felt different. They felt real. The interview lasted 2 hours. We talked about everything, from her previous employment to her cooking skills to her philosophy on childcare. She adored children, she told me, and had helped raise the 3 kids of her previous employer from toddlers to teenagers. She was an excellent cook, specializing in both Filipino cuisine and American comfort food. She didn't drink, didn't smoke, and had no social life that would interfere with her work. Her only request was 1 Sunday off per month to attend church and visit a few friends from her community. Otherwise, she was happy to live in, to be available whenever I needed her. By the end of the interview, I knew I was going to hire her, but I did my due diligence anyway. I called the family in London, speaking directly with the mother, whose name was Elizabeth Crawford. She couldn't say enough good things about Maria. "She's remarkable," Elizabeth told me over the phone, her British accent lending weight to every word. "Absolutely remarkable. She ran our household flawlessly for 8 years. She was wonderful with the children, she never overstepped, and she was completely trustworthy. I left her alone in our home with access to everything, including the safe combination and our financial documents when she needed to pay bills. There was never a single issue. The only reason she's not with us now is that she couldn't relocate to the UK due to family obligations. You would be lucky to have her, Mrs. Thornton." That reference sealed the deal. 1 week later, Maria moved into the small apartment above our garage that Daniel and I had originally designed as a guest suite. She had very few possessions, just a few suitcases of clothes, some framed photographs of what she described as friends and extended family back in the Philippines, and a well-worn Bible that she kept on her bedside table. I helped her set up the apartment, and as we hung her modest curtains together, I felt something I hadn't felt in nearly a year: hope. Maybe things were going to get better. Maybe I wasn't completely alone after all. For the first 6 months, Maria was everything I had hoped for and more. She kept the house immaculate without ever making me feel like I was in the way. She cooked meals that Sophie and I actually wanted to eat, hearty soups and roasted chickens and fresh vegetables that weren't just nutritious, but delicious. She was gentle with Sophie, reading her stories, helping her with her kindergarten homework, being there when I was too exhausted or too lost in my own grief to be the mother I wanted to be. She never judged me for the days when I couldn't get out of bed until noon, never commented on the wine bottles that sometimes accumulated a bit too quickly in the recycling bin. She simply took care of everything with quiet efficiency and what seemed like genuine love. Slowly, I began to heal. The sharp edges of my grief started to dull, not disappearing entirely, but becoming something I could live with rather than something that was killing me. I started taking on more design clients, finding joy again in my work. I began seeing a therapist who helped me process not just Daniel's death, but my identity as a widow and single mother. I even went on a few dates, awkward and largely unsuccessful, but the fact that I was trying felt like progress. Through all of it, Maria was there, a steady presence that I came to rely on more than I had ever relied on anyone except Daniel. Sophie adored her. My daughter, who had become clingy and fearful after losing her father, blossomed under Maria's attention. She started sleeping through the night again. She made friends at school. She laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. Watching my daughter return to something resembling a normal childhood felt like a miracle, and I credited Maria with being a huge part of that healing. I gave her bonuses, gift cards, extra time off. I bought her a new car when her old one broke down, a sensible Honda that she protested was too much, but eventually accepted with tearful gratitude. I raised her salary 3 times in 2 years until she was making nearly twice what the agency had originally suggested as a fair rate. She was worth every penny, I told myself. She was irreplaceable. By the time 2 years had passed since Maria joined our household, I considered her family. Not just in the cliched way that people describe their household help, but genuinely, deeply family. I knew about her childhood in Manila, about her father who had died when she was young, and her mother who had worked as a domestic helper in Saudi Arabia to support the family. I knew about her heartbreak in her 20s when a fiancé had left her for another woman, a wound that she said had never fully healed. I knew about her devout faith, her love of gardening, her secret passion for Filipino soap operas that she watched on her laptop in her apartment after Sophie went to bed. She knew everything about me too, my fears and hopes, my complicated relationship with my own mother, my lingering grief for Daniel, my tentative dreams for the future. We weren't employer and employee anymore. We were, I believed, true friends. That belief was the first thing Maria used against me. The trouble started so quietly that I didn't notice it at first. Small things, insignificant on their own, that only made sense in retrospect. A credit card statement that seemed higher than usual, which I attributed to holiday shopping and forgot about. A call from my accountant asking about a large withdrawal from my savings account that I didn't remember authorizing, which I assumed was a banking error and had him look into. A few pieces of jewelry that I couldn't locate, which I blamed on my own disorganization and post-grief brain fog. Life was busy, and I was finally starting to feel like myself again. I didn't have time to worry about minor mysteries. The first real warning sign came almost 3 years after Maria had entered my life, about a year ago from where I stand now. Sophie was 8, finishing up 3rd grade, and I was busier than I had been since Daniel's death. A major design project for a boutique hotel had consumed most of my attention for months, and I was often out of the house for site visits, client meetings, and shopping trips to furniture showrooms. Maria was with Sophie more than I was during those months, picking her up from school, supervising her homework, cooking her dinner, putting her to bed on nights when I came home late. I felt guilty about it, but I also felt like I was finally living again, finally becoming something more than just Daniel's widow or Sophie's mom. Maria assured me constantly that everything was fine, that Sophie was happy, that I should focus on my work and not worry. It was Claire who first planted the seed of suspicion. Claire Mitchell had been my best friend since college, a razor-sharp attorney who worked for a prestigious firm in downtown Boston. She had been my rock through Daniel's death, through the hard years that followed, and she knew me better than almost anyone. She also, I would come to learn, had never fully trusted Maria. We were having lunch at our usual spot, a farm-to-table restaurant in the Back Bay, when Claire put down her fork and looked at me with an expression I recognized from years of friendship. It was her, "I need to tell you something you don't want to hear" face. "Becca," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you not to get defensive." I felt my guard go up immediately. "What is it? How much do you actually know about Maria's background, like beyond what the agency told you?" I blinked, confused by the question. "I know a lot. We've talked for hours over the past 3 years. I know about her family, her childhood, her past relationships. Why? Claire hesitated. I ran into someone at a bar association event last week, an immigration attorney named David Chen. We got to talking, and I mentioned that my best friend has an amazing housekeeper from the Philippines, been with her for years, used to work for a family who moved to London. He gave me this strange look and said that story sounded familiar, that he had worked on a case a few years back involving a domestic worker with a similar background who had been accused of financial exploitation by a previous employer. The case was settled quietly before it went to trial, so there's no public record. He couldn't remember the woman's name, but the details stuck with me. My first instinct was to dismiss this entirely. Maria? Financial exploitation? The idea was absurd. This was the woman who had held my hand when I cried, who had nursed my daughter through stomach flu, who had turned down expensive gifts because she said they were too extravagant. Claire, there are thousands of Filipina domestic workers in the Boston area. It's a coincidence. Probably, Claire agreed, though her expression suggested she wasn't convinced. But Becca, when was the last time you really looked at your finances, like actually sat down and went through everything? The question made me uncomfortable because I knew the answer. Daniel had always handled our money, and after his death, I had hired a financial advisor and an accountant to manage everything because I couldn't bear to do it myself. I signed whatever they put in front of me, trusted them to keep track of the millions that were supposed to keep Sophie and me secure for the rest of our lives. I hadn't personally reconciled a bank statement in years. I have professionals who handle that, I said, hearing the defensiveness in my own voice. I know you do, and that's fine, but professionals manage what you give them. They're not detectives. If someone with access to your accounts, someone who lived in your house and knew your routines and had your trust, was slowly siphoning money, would your accountant even notice? Would you? I felt a flash of anger. Maria doesn't have access to my accounts. Doesn't she? She pays bills, right? Picks up groceries, makes purchases for the household. With a credit card that has a limit, a household card. A household card that's linked to an account you have passwords and pins for. Passwords and pins that you might have written down somewhere, or that she might have seen you enter 100 times over 3 years. I wanted to argue, but something cold was settling in my stomach. The truth was, Maria had seen me enter passwords many times. She knew where I kept the spare checkbook. She had access to my home office, where I kept files and documents that I rarely looked at myself. She paid the household bills online using a laptop that I had given her, a laptop connected to accounts that paid for everything from groceries to utilities to Sophie's dance lessons. You're being paranoid, I said, but the words felt hollow. Maybe, Claire said. Probably. But Becca, you've been through so much. You're finally doing well again. I just think it wouldn't hurt to look. Really look. At your finances, at Maria's background, at everything. If I'm wrong, you've lost nothing but a few hours. But if I'm right... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I went home that night with Claire's words echoing in my head. Maria had prepared a beautiful dinner of roasted salmon and asparagus, and Sophie was chattering about her day at school while Maria smiled and asked follow-up questions, and everything seemed so normal that I felt ashamed of myself for even entertaining Claire's suspicions. This woman had devoted 3 years of her life to my family. She had been there through my darkest moments. Doubting her felt like a betrayal of everything we had built together. But that night, after Sophie was in bed and Maria had retired to her apartment, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the missing jewelry, the unusual credit card charges, the withdrawal my accountant had questioned months ago. At 2 a.m, I gave up on sleep and went to my home office. I hadn't really spent time in there since before Daniel's death. It had been his space, and entering it still felt like walking into a shrine. His books were still on the shelves, his awards and photographs still on the walls. But it was also where I kept the files. I started with the household credit card statements. At first, everything seemed normal. Groceries, gas for Maria's car, school supplies, the occasional household item. But as I looked more closely, I noticed a pattern. Small charges, never more than a few $100s at stores I didn't recognize. Electronics retailers, clothing stores, jewelry shops. I had never questioned these because the overall monthly totals seemed reasonable, and I trusted Maria implicitly. But when I added up these unfamiliar charges over the past year alone, my stomach dropped. They totaled nearly $15,000. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe Maria was buying things for the house that I had forgotten about. Maybe she was picking up gifts for my daughter's friends' birthday parties. Maybe I was misreading the statements. But when I moved from the credit card to my bank accounts, the cold feeling in my stomach turned to ice. My financial advisor had sent me quarterly summaries that I barely glanced at before filing away. Now, I pulled out every statement from the past 3 years and began comparing them. The first year after Daniel's death, my total assets were just over $12 million. The most recent statement showed a little over $9 million. I had lost $3 million in 3 years. My first thought was the stock market. Investments fluctuate. I had withdrawn money for living expenses and renovations on the house. But $3 million? I lived well, but not extravagantly. The house was paid off. Sophie's school was expensive, but not that expensive. Where had the money gone? I spent the rest of the night going through bank statements, cross-referencing them with the summaries from my financial advisor. What I found made my blood run cold. Wire transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, tens of thousands of dollars at a time, checks written to names I had never heard of, cash withdrawals that I had no memory of making, all of them modest enough individually not to trigger any alarms, all of them spread out over months and years, all of them adding up to a fortune that had simply evaporated. By dawn, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the papers. I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, that my accountant had made errors, that the bank had been hacked, that anyone other than Maria was responsible. But one thing kept jumping out at me from the statements. The timing. The suspicious transaction started about 8 months after Maria had joined our household, around the time I had given her more responsibility and access, around the time I had started trusting her with everything. I called in sick to my design project that morning and called Claire instead. She listened without interrupting as I described what I had found, and when I finished, her voice was grimmer than I had ever heard it. "Becca, don't confront her. Don't say a word to her. Act completely normal. Can you do that?" "I don't know," I said honestly. The idea of looking Maria in the face, of pretending everything was fine while suspecting she had stolen millions from me, made me physically ill. "You have to. If she knows you're on to her, she'll cover her tracks, maybe disappear entirely, and you'll never get answers or justice. You need to hire a private investigator, someone good, someone who can dig into her background and follow the money, and you need to do it quietly. Can you get out of the house today?" I could. I told Maria that I had meetings all day and that she should pick Sophie up from school and keep an eye on her until I got home. Maria smiled, wished me a productive day, and asked if I wanted her to make something special for dinner. I managed to smile back, to say that would be lovely, and then I walked out of my house and sat in my car in the driveway for 5 minutes, gripping the steering wheel and trying not to throw up. Claire met me at her office and introduced me to Thomas Brennan, a private investigator her firm had used on various cases. He was a tall, unassuming man in his mid-40s, with the kind of face you would forget immediately after meeting him, which I supposed was an asset in his line of work. We sat in a conference room, and I told him everything. Maria's history as I knew it, the suspicious financial activity, Claire's colleague's warning about a previous accusation. Thomas took notes, asked questions, and his expression never changed. When I finished, he looked at me with eyes that seemed to see straight through me. "Mrs. Thornton, I have to be honest with you. What you're describing, if it's true, is a long-term financial exploitation by someone who has positioned herself perfectly to avoid detection. This kind of perpetrator is smart, patient, and methodical. They don't make big mistakes. Finding proof that can hold up in court is going to take time and resources. Are you prepared for that? Yes, I said without hesitation. Whatever it takes. Good. Then here's what I need from you. First, don't change anything at home. Don't fire Maria. Don't restrict her access. Don't give any indication that you suspect anything. If she senses a shift, she'll either destroy evidence or disappear, possibly both. Second, I need copies of all your financial statements, bank records, credit card bills, anything that shows the movement of money over the past 3 years. Third, I need you to tell me everything you know about Maria's background, every name she's ever mentioned, every detail of her life story. I'm going to verify all of it. If there are lies in her past, I'll find them. I spent the rest of that day gathering documents and compiling everything I knew about Maria into a detailed written statement. It was strange, putting into words all the intimate details she had shared with me over the years. The father who died when she was young, the mother who worked overseas, the faithless fiancé, the family in Newton who had loved her like one of their own. As I wrote, I couldn't help wondering how much of it was true and how much was an elaborate fiction designed to make me trust her. That evening, I returned home and had dinner with Sophie and Maria as if nothing had happened. Maria had prepared fried rice and spring rolls, one of Sophie's favorite meals, and she chattered about a project she was working on in the garden, planting tomatoes that she hoped would thrive in the summer heat. I nodded and smiled and contributed to the conversation, but everything felt surreal, like I was watching myself from outside my own body. After Sophie went to bed, Maria asked if I was feeling all right. I looked tired, she said. Was I coming down with something? Just stressed about work, I told her. Nothing to worry about. She patted my hand. You work too hard, Mrs. Thornton. You need to take care of yourself. Sophie needs you healthy and strong. I managed to thank her for her concern and excused myself to my bedroom, where I locked the door and cried silently into my pillow. Whether from grief or fear, or the awful suspicion that the woman who had just expressed such tender concern for my well-being was the same person who had stolen millions from me and my daughter, I couldn't say. It was all tangled together, a knot of emotions I couldn't begin to unravel. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life since Daniel's death. I lived a double existence, playing the role of trusting employer and friend during the day while meeting secretly with Thomas Brennan to review his findings. And what he was finding confirmed my worst fears. First, he verified Maria's employment history. The family in Newton, the Crawfords, had indeed employed Maria for 8 years, just as she had claimed. But when Thomas dug deeper, interviewing former neighbors and tracking down household staff who had worked alongside Maria, a different picture emerged. 2 years before the Crawfords moved to London, the wife, Elizabeth, had discovered irregularities in the household accounts. Small amounts of money had been going missing over several years. Elizabeth had initially blamed the problem on a gardener who had been fired without being given a chance to defend himself. It wasn't until after the Crawfords relocated that a forensic audit of their finances revealed the truth. Someone had been systematically embezzling from them for years, using their accounts to make small purchases and transfers that flew under the radar. By then, Elizabeth didn't want to pursue the matter. The family had moved on, the amount lost was significant, but not devastating, and the hassle of an international investigation seemed overwhelming. They never officially accused Maria, but Thomas tracked down a private email exchange between Elizabeth and her attorney that made it clear they suspected her. When Thomas told me this, I felt the floor drop out from under me. Maria hadn't just stolen from me. She had done this before, to the family she had described as loving her like one of their own. The glowing reference letter that had convinced me to hire her was either written before Elizabeth discovered the theft or was a lie meant to help Maria find her next victim. But it got worse. Thomas ran a comprehensive background check on Maria Santos and discovered that the woman I knew bore almost no resemblance to the person she claimed to be. Yes, she was originally from the Philippines. Yes, she had immigrated to the United States in her late 20s. But the rest of her story, the dead father, the hard-working mother, the heartbreaking fiancé, all of it was fiction. Maria's father was alive and well, living in a comfortable house in Manila that, based on property records, was far nicer than any domestic worker's salary could have afforded. Her mother had never worked overseas. She had been a local shopkeeper until her retirement, and Maria herself had a history that the agency had somehow failed to uncover, probably because she had used falsified documents and references that were never thoroughly verified. The story of the fiancé, the one who had broken her heart, was the most disturbing discovery of all. Maria had indeed been engaged in her 20s to a Filipino-American businessman named Ricardo Alvarez. He hadn't left her for another woman. He had died under circumstances that Thomas was still investigating, but that appeared suspicious. Ricardo had been a successful importer with a small but thriving business, and after his death, his finances had been in chaos. Large sums of money were missing, and his family had suspected foul play but could never prove anything. Maria had been his live-in fiancée at the time, had managed his household, had had access to all his accounts. Sound familiar? Thomas laid out the pattern for me in his cramped office, photographs and documents spread across his desk. She finds vulnerable marks, usually through domestic work placements. She presents as the perfect employee, reliable, trustworthy, devoted. She takes her time, builds trust over months or years, and then she slowly bleeds them dry. By the time they realize what's happening, if they ever do, she's already moved on to the next target. You're not her first victim, Mrs. Thornton, and if we don't stop her, you won't be her last. The question became what to do with this information. I wanted to have Maria arrested immediately, but Thomas cautioned me against moving too quickly. We had circumstantial evidence and a pattern of suspicious behavior, but proving in court that Maria had specifically stolen from me would require more. We needed to trace the money, to follow where the wire transfers and checks had actually gone, to prove that Maria was the one who had initiated them and that the funds had ended up in her control. This meant bringing in a forensic accountant, which Claire arranged through her firm. It meant subpoenaing bank records and tracing accounts that had been opened under false names and fake social security numbers. It meant building a case that could withstand the scrutiny of a criminal trial. And all of it had to happen while I continued to live under the same roof as Maria, continued to entrust her with my home and my daughter, continued to pretend that nothing was wrong. There were nights when I considered simply confronting her, screaming at her, throwing her out of my house and my life. The rage I felt was almost unbearable, a burning fury at the violation of my trust, at the exploitation of my grief, at the sheer calculated cruelty of what she had done. But I forced myself to stay calm, to play the long game, because I wanted more than just to be rid of her. I wanted justice. I wanted her to face real consequences for what she had done to me, and to however many victims had come before me. And there was something else, something I only admitted to myself in my darkest moments. I wanted to understand. I wanted to know why. What kind of person does this? What kind of person moves into a grieving widow's home, cares for her traumatized child, wipes her tears and cooks her meals and pretends to be her friend, all while systematically stealing everything she has? Was Maria a sociopath, a con artist, simply greedy? Or was there something in her past, something that explained how she had become this person? I became obsessed with this question. I pored over the reports Thomas brought me, looking for clues. I replayed our conversations in my head, analyzing every word for hidden meanings. I watched Maria more closely than I ever had before, studying her face when she thought no one was looking, trying to see past the mask to the real person underneath. But if there was a real person there, she was hidden too deeply for me to find. About 2 months into the investigation, Thomas came to me with a breakthrough. He had managed to trace several of the wire transfers from my accounts to a series of shell companies, which eventually led to a bank account in the Philippines under the name of a woman named Gloria Santos, Maria's sister. They're working together, Thomas explained. Maria does the work here, gains access to wealthy families, siphons off the money gradually. She sends it overseas in amounts small enough not to trigger international reporting requirements, and her sister launders it through the shell companies. The money ends up buying property, businesses, investments, all in Gloria's name but benefiting the whole family. It's a family operation. A family operation. Maria had told me she had no close family, that she was essentially alone in the world. One more lie among hundreds. Thomas had more. He had tracked down 2 other families in the Boston area who had employed Maria over the past 15 years before the Crawfords. Both had experienced mysterious financial irregularities during her tenure. One family had lost nearly $500,000 before finally firing Maria over what they thought was a minor issue unrelated to the theft. They had never connected the financial problems to their housekeeper. The other family had suspected Maria, but couldn't prove anything and had been too embarrassed to pursue it publicly. A wealthy widow being swindled by the help, they seemed to feel, reflected badly on them. They had quietly let Maria go and tried to forget the whole thing. I wasn't going to let Maria get away with it this time. I wasn't going to stay quiet out of embarrassment or sweep this under the rug to avoid scandal. I was going to expose her, make her face what she had done, and ensure that she never did it to anyone else. But first, I needed to get my daughter out of that house. I invented a story about my mother needing help after surgery, which wasn't entirely untrue as my mother had had her hip replaced the previous year and still sometimes needed assistance. I told Sophie we were going to stay with Grandma for a few weeks, just the 2 of us, a fun extended visit. Sophie was confused about why Maria wasn't coming with us, but I explained that Maria needed to stay and look after the house while we were away. Maria, to her credit, played along perfectly, helping us pack, wishing us a wonderful trip, promising to have everything perfect when we returned. As we drove away from the house, I watched Maria standing in the driveway, waving. She was smiling, that warm, kind smile that had comforted me through so many hard nights. And I felt something break inside me, the last remaining piece of trust I had placed in another human being since Daniel's death. Sophie and I stayed with my mother in her condo in Providence for 3 weeks while Thomas and the forensic accountant finalized the investigation. It was there, in my mother's small, cozy guest room, that I finally received the complete picture of what Maria had done to me. Over the course of nearly 3 years, she had stolen approximately $2.8 million from my accounts. She had done it through a combination of methods: small, regular charges on the household credit card for personal purchases she kept or resold, checks written to fake vendors for services never rendered, wire transfers to her sister's accounts overseas, and cash withdrawals using ATM cards she had somehow obtained through identity theft, using personal information she had gathered from living in my home. She had been careful, patient, and methodical. If I had continued trusting her blindly, she could have continued for years more, until there was nothing left. The forensic accountant estimated that, at her current rate of theft, Maria would have drained my entire fortune within another 5 to 7 years. She would have left me with nothing, left Sophie with nothing. All the security that Daniel's hard work and careful planning had provided would have evaporated, stolen by the woman I had trusted to help me rebuild my life. The morning after I received this report, I sat in my mother's kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, and made a decision. I wasn't just going to report Maria to the police. I was going to destroy her. I don't mean violently, I mean completely. I was going to make sure that when this was over, everyone would know what she had done. Her name would be public. Her methods would be exposed. Her family in the Philippines would face consequences for their role in laundering stolen money. The agencies that had placed her would be held accountable for their failure to properly vet her. Every future victim she might have preyed upon would be protected by the publicity of her crimes, and Maria herself would face the full force of the American justice system. I called Claire and told her I was ready to move forward. She had already been working with the district attorney's office, laying the groundwork for criminal charges. Thomas had compiled a dossier of evidence that would make any prosecutor's mouth water. All that remained was to spring the trap. The plan was carefully orchestrated. I would return home with Sophie under the pretense that my mother was recovering well and we missed our own house. I would act normal for a few days, allowing Maria to believe that everything was fine. Meanwhile, the police would obtain warrants and prepare to arrest her at the house, minimizing the chance that she could flee or destroy evidence. The day of my return was surreal. Sophie was excited to be home, running through the house and checking on her room, her toys, her backyard swing set. Maria greeted us with her usual warmth, commenting on how much she had missed us, how quiet the house had been without Sophie's laughter. She had prepared a welcome home dinner, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh green beans from the garden. My favorite. I sat at that dinner table and ate the food of the woman who had stolen millions from me, who had exploited my grief and my trust, who had treated me as nothing more than a mark to be fleeced. I ate and smiled and thanked her for the lovely meal. And when she asked about my mother, I told her stories, elaborated on the fiction I had created, all while knowing that in less than 48 hours, this woman would be in handcuffs. The police came on a Tuesday morning. I had made sure Sophie was at school, had arranged for my mother to come up and be there for her so I could be present for Maria's arrest. At 9 o'clock, 3 detectives and 2 uniformed officers arrived at my door with warrants for Maria's arrest and for the search of her apartment above the garage. I answered the door and let them in, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Maria was in the kitchen washing the breakfast dishes. When the detectives entered and identified themselves, she turned around with a confused expression. "Is there a problem? Mrs. Thornton, what's happening?" "Maria Santos," the lead detective said. "You're under arrest for grand larceny, fraud, and identity theft. You have the right to remain silent." I watched as they put handcuffs on her, as they read her rights, as they led her out of my kitchen and toward the police cars waiting in the driveway. And as she passed me, Maria looked into my eyes, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip. The warm, maternal expression vanished, replaced by something cold, something calculating, something that I now recognized as the real Maria. She didn't say a word, but her eyes said everything. They said, "You think you've won, but this isn't over." The search of Maria's apartment revealed a treasure trove of evidence. Hidden in a locked trunk under her bed were documents that connected her to accounts I had never known about, fake identification cards, burner phones, and most damning of all, a detailed ledger in her own handwriting that tracked every dollar she had stolen from me over nearly 3 years. She had kept meticulous records, either out of some compulsion or because she needed to account for the money she was sending to her sister overseas. Either way, it was a gift to the prosecution. The case against Maria was overwhelming. She was charged with multiple counts of grand larceny, wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Her sister Gloria was also indicted, though she remained in the Philippines, where U.S. law enforcement was working with local authorities to pursue extradition. The DA's office estimated that between my case and the evidence linking Maria to her previous victims, they could prove she had stolen over $4 million over 15 years of targeting wealthy families. But Maria wasn't going to go down without a fight. She hired a defense attorney, an expensive one whose fees I suspected were being paid with my stolen money that had already been laundered overseas. And her defense strategy became clear as soon as the pre-trial hearings began. She was going to attack my credibility, paint me as a mentally unstable widow who had mismanaged her own finances and was looking for someone to blame. I expected this. Thomas and Claire had warned me that defense attorneys in embezzlement cases often try to muddy the waters to confuse juries with alternative explanations for missing money. But I wasn't prepared for how personal it would get. Maria's attorney subpoenaed my medical records, including my therapy sessions. He attempted to introduce evidence that I had struggled with depression and anxiety after Daniel's death, that I had at times used alcohol to cope, that I had been in such a fog of grief that I couldn't possibly have kept track of my own finances. He implied, without directly stating, that I had given Maria permission to use my money and had simply forgotten, or that I had made bad investments and was trying to cover my embarrassment with a theft accusation. The lowest blow came when he put a private investigator on the stand who testified that I had briefly dated a man named Eric Townsend, about a year after Daniel's death. The implication was that I had been spending money recklessly on romantic pursuits and was now trying to cover my tracks. Never mind that my relationship with Eric had lasted all of 3 dates and had involved nothing more expensive than a few dinners out. Never mind that it was completely irrelevant to the question of whether Maria had stolen from me. The defense's strategy was to humiliate me, to make me seem unreliable and unstable, to shift the jury's sympathy away from me and toward Maria. But I had my own strategy, and it was built on the truth. When it was my turn to testify, I sat in that witness chair and told my story. I started with Daniel's death, with the devastating grief that had followed, with my decision to hire Maria and the years of trust I had placed in her. I described how she had insinuated herself into every aspect of my life, how she had become not just an employee, but a confidant, how I had considered her family. And then I described the moment I discovered the truth, the late nights going through financial statements, the slow dawning horror of realizing that someone I trusted completely had been stealing from me all along. I didn't cry. I had cried enough in the privacy of my own home, and I wasn't going to give Maria's defense the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I was calm, clear, and specific. I had dates and figures memorized. I could explain exactly how the money had been taken and where it had gone. I was, as Claire had coached me to be, the perfect witness, sympathetic enough to evoke the jury's compassion, but credible enough to withstand aggressive cross-examination. The defense attorney tried his best to rattle me, to find inconsistencies in my testimony, to paint me as confused or vindictive. But I held my ground. When he suggested that I had simply been careless with my money and was blaming Maria for my own mistakes, I looked him directly in the eye and said, "I trusted Maria Santos with my home, my daughter, and my heart. She repaid that trust by stealing nearly $3 million from me and my child. That's not my mistake. That's her crime." The trial lasted 3 weeks. In addition to my testimony, the prosecution presented the forensic accountant's analysis, Thomas Brennan's investigation, and the physical evidence recovered from Maria's apartment. They called witnesses from Maria's previous employers, including a tearful Elizabeth Crawford who had flown in from London to testify about her own experience. They established a clear pattern of behavior. Maria targeted vulnerable families, built trust over time, and then systematically stole from them while pretending to be a devoted helper. Maria herself never testified. Her attorney advised against it, probably because they knew that any story she told would be picked apart by the prosecution. She sat at the defense table throughout the trial, dressed conservatively, her expression impassive. Sometimes she would look at me and I would feel the weight of her gaze, but I never looked back. I was done engaging with her. She was no longer a person to me. She was just a problem to be solved. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. I was in the courtroom when the foreman read the verdicts: guilty of grand larceny in the first degree, guilty of wire fraud, guilty of identity theft, guilty of conspiracy to commit money laundering. With each word, I felt something release in my chest, a tension I had been carrying for months, years, maybe since Daniel's death. This wasn't going to bring my money back. Not all of it anyway. This wasn't going to erase the betrayal or heal the wounds Maria had inflicted on my ability to trust. But it was justice. Real, tangible, public justice. Maria was sentenced 2 months later. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Knowles, was not sympathetic to the defense's pleas for leniency. She noted Maria's long history of preying on vulnerable families, her complete lack of remorse, and the devastating impact her crimes had had on her victims. She sentenced Maria to 15 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 10 years. She also ordered restitution, though everyone knew that recovering money that had been laundered through overseas accounts would be a long and uncertain process. As Maria was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she looked back at me one final time, and for the first time since her arrest, she spoke directly to me. "You think you're better than me," she said. her voice low but clear. "You're not. You're just luckier." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The orange jumpsuit she was wearing, the handcuffs on her wrists, the prison sentence she was about to begin, those were my response. I had taken my power back. I had protected my daughter. I had ensured that this woman would never prey on another grieving family. Part 2. The aftermath of Maria's conviction was complicated. There was relief, certainly, but also a profound exhaustion. I had spent over a year living in a state of constant vigilance, pretending, investigating, preparing for trial. Now that it was over, I didn't know what to do with myself. Sophie, bless her, was resilient. I had tried to shield her from the worst of it, explaining only that Maria had done something wrong and had to go away. She was confused at first, then sad, and then, with the adaptability of children, she moved on. She made new friends, threw herself into school, seemed determined to grow up into a well-adjusted kid despite everything. Watching her thrive was the greatest reward I could have asked for. I sold the house in Brookline. I couldn't live there anymore, couldn't walk through those rooms without thinking of Maria's hands touching everything, Maria's eyes watching me, Maria's lies polluting every memory. We moved to a smaller place in Cambridge, a brownstone that felt fresh and new and untainted. I hired a cleaning service that came twice a week, bonded and insured, with no live-in staff. I wasn't ready to trust anyone in my home again. I wasn't sure I ever would be. The restitution process dragged on for months. International asset recovery is complicated, especially when the money has been laundered through multiple jurisdictions. Gloria, Maria's sister, fought extradition from the Philippines and lost. She was eventually brought to the U.S., tried, and convicted of money laundering. She received 8 years in prison. Between the two of them, law enforcement was able to trace and recover approximately $1.2 million of what had been stolen from me. It was less than half, but it was something. I used part of that recovered money to establish a foundation in Daniel's name. The Thornton Trust provides financial literacy education to widows and other vulnerable populations, teaching them how to protect themselves from exactly the kind of exploitation Maria had perpetrated. We also fund background check scholarships for families who want to hire domestic workers but can't afford thorough vetting. It's my way of trying to ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen to others. Claire remains my best friend, now closer than ever after everything we went through together. She checked in on me obsessively for the first year after the trial, probably more worried about my mental state than she let on. But I surprised both of us by doing okay. Not great, not healed, but okay. I was in therapy twice a week, processing not just Maria's betrayal, but all the grief and trauma that had made me vulnerable to her in the first place. I learned to set boundaries, to trust my instincts, to stop feeling guilty for protecting myself. Dating was a challenge. The few men I went out with in the year after the trial inevitably wanted to know why I seemed so guarded, why I had trust issues, why a successful, attractive woman in her mid-30s wasn't already in a relationship. Explaining that my last close relationship outside of family had been with a woman who stole millions from me while pretending to be my friend tended to end conversations quickly. I made peace with the possibility that I might be single for a long time. I had Sophie. I had Claire. I had my work, which was thriving again now that I could focus on it fully. That was enough. Then, about 6 months ago, something unexpected happened. Thomas Brennan, the private investigator who had been instrumental in building the case against Maria, called me out of the blue. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, "I have something you might want to hear. It's about Maria Santos." I felt my heart rate spike. Maria was in prison. The case was closed. What more could there possibly be? "She's been talking," Thomas continued, "to the prison chaplain, to a counselor, to anyone who will listen. Apparently, she's found religion, claims she's a changed woman, wants to make amends. The prison granted her permission to write letters to her victims as part of some restorative justice program. You're about to receive one. I didn't know what to say. The idea of reading a letter from Maria, of letting her words into my life again in any form, made me feel physically ill. But I was also curious. What could she possibly say that would make a difference? The letter arrived a week later. It was handwritten, several pages long, and I could tell from the careful penmanship that she had taken her time with it. I sat in my new living room, Sophie safely at a friend's house, and read it twice. In the letter, Maria apologized. Not in a generic, legalistic way designed to look good to a parole board, but specifically. She apologized for exploiting my grief, for manipulating my trust, for stealing not just my money, but my sense of safety in the world. She apologized for what she had put Sophie through. She described her own childhood, not the fictional one she had told me, but the real one. A father who was abusive and a mother who coped by obsessively hoarding money, by teaching her daughters that the only security in the world came from taking what you could, however you could get it. She described her own shame, her knowledge that what she was doing was wrong even as she continued to do it, her inability to stop because the money represented safety, and she had never felt safe a day in her life. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She specifically said she knew she didn't deserve it and wasn't seeking it. She said she was writing because the therapist at the prison told her it might help her own healing, and because she felt I deserved to know that she understood finally the magnitude of what she had done. I read that letter and felt something I didn't expect. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of release. Not from anger or pain, but from the obsessive need to understand that had haunted me for years. I finally understood. Maria wasn't a monster. She was a damaged person who had made monstrous choices shaped by a childhood I couldn't imagine, and a warped value system that had taken decades to develop. Understanding didn't excuse what she had done, but it allowed me to stop wondering, to stop analyzing, to stop giving her space in my head. I wrote back to her. A short letter, just a few paragraphs, telling her that I had received her apology and that while I couldn't forgive her, I hoped she would use her time in prison to become a genuinely different person. I told her that the best amends she could make would be to never harm anyone again once she was released, and to spend the rest of her life trying to contribute something positive to a world she had taken so much from. And then I sealed the envelope, mailed it, and let it go. That correspondence, strangely enough, was the final step in my healing. I stopped thinking about Maria. I stopped having nightmares about her standing in my kitchen, smiling that warm smile while secretly destroying my life. I started looking forward instead of backward, thinking about what I wanted my future to be, instead of obsessing over the past I couldn't change. Sophie is 10 now, finishing 4th grade, and she's the light of my life. She still remembers Maria, occasionally asking questions that I answer as honestly as I can in age-appropriate ways. She knows that Maria did something wrong with money and that she had to go to prison. She knows that I was sad for a while, but that I'm better now. Someday, when she's older, I'll tell her the whole story. But for now, she's allowed to be a kid, to trust the world, to believe that most people are good. I won't let Maria's betrayal steal that from her. 6 weeks ago, I went on a date with a man named James. He's a pediatric surgeon, kind and patient, with an ex-wife and 2 kids of his own. We've been out 4 times now, and I like him. More importantly, I trust him. Or at least I'm learning to. I'm not rushing into anything, but for the first time since Daniel died, I can imagine a future with someone new. Not a replacement for what I had, but something different, something that's mine. There's one more thing I need to tell you, something that happened just last week that brought this whole story full circle. I was at a coffee shop near my office, reviewing plans for a new project, when a woman approached my table. She was in her early 50s, well-dressed with an expensive handbag and perfectly manicured nails. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "Are you Rebecca Thornton?" I felt my guard go up immediately. "Who's asking?" "My name is Linda Foster. I almost hired Maria Santos 3 years ago, right before you did. The agency recommended her, and I had her in for an interview. She was perfect, exactly what I was looking for. But something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but my gut told me not to hire her, so I didn't. She sat down across from me, her eyes filling with tears. I followed your trial. When I saw her face in the news, I nearly collapsed. It could have been me. That could have been my money, my family, my life. I've wanted to thank you ever since, but I didn't know how to reach you. And then I saw you sitting here, and I had to say something. I didn't know how to respond. This woman was a stranger who had come within inches of suffering the same fate I had, saved only by an instinct she couldn't explain. I'm glad you trusted your gut, I finally said. I'm sorry for what you went through, she replied. But you should know that because you came forward, because you were willing to go public and go to trial, you've protected who knows how many other families. Maria can't hurt anyone else now. That's because of you. We talked for nearly an hour. Linda told me about her own family, her 3 grandchildren, the comfortable retirement she was enjoying with her husband of 30 years. She told me that after reading about my case, she had become an advocate for better regulation of domestic worker placement agencies, pushing for mandatory background checks and financial auditing requirements. She had started a support group for victims of household employee fraud. She was turning what could have been her tragedy into purpose, just as I was trying to do with the Thornton Trust. When we parted, she hugged me, a stranger's embrace that somehow felt like the closing of a circle. I walked home that day feeling something I hadn't felt in years: pride. Not just relief that the ordeal was over or gratitude that I had survived, but genuine pride in what I had done. I had fought back, I had won, and in winning, I had protected others. That's my story. It's not a happy story exactly. $3 million is still mostly gone. 3 years of my life were spent either being victimized or fighting for justice. The woman I thought was my friend, my family, turned out to be a predator who saw me as nothing more than prey. Trust, once broken so completely, doesn't just grow back on its own. It takes work every single day to remind myself that not everyone is Maria. But I'm here. I'm standing. I'm building a life that's mine, not defined by Daniel's death or Maria's betrayal, but by my own choices, my own strength, my own refusal to let the worst thing that happened to me be the end of my story. Sometimes I still think about Maria in her prison cell, reading her Bible, claiming to be reformed. I wonder if she really has changed or if she's just running another long con, this time with the parole board as the mark. I wonder if I'll have to testify against her when she comes up for parole in a few years, if I'll have to relive all of this again to make sure she stays behind bars. And I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I had listened to Claire sooner. If I had been more suspicious, less trusting, more careful with the fortune Daniel had left me. Would I have caught Maria earlier? Would I have saved more money, more pain, more years of my life? But I can't change the past. I can only move forward. And moving forward means accepting that I was a victim, yes, but I am also a survivor. I took the worst betrayal imaginable and turned it into justice. I protected my daughter. I protected future victims. I protected myself. Maria Santos was my maid, and she became my enemy. She took almost everything I had, but she didn't take my strength, my resilience, or my ability to rebuild. Those things are mine, and no one can steal them. Every morning now, I wake up in my brownstone in Cambridge, make coffee in my own kitchen with my own hands, and look out the window at a world that feels, for the first time in years, full of possibility. Sophie will be up soon, needing breakfast and help finding her shoes and a dozen other small tasks that make up the beautiful monotony of motherhood. I'll take her to school, then head to my office, where clients are waiting for my vision, my creativity, my expertise. And tonight, maybe I'll have dinner with James. We'll talk about our kids, our work, our hopes for the future. I'll watch his face as he tells a story, looking for signs of deception, and then I'll remind myself that not everyone is hiding something. I'll take a risk, as small as letting myself enjoy the evening, and I'll call it progress, because that's what recovery looks like. It's not a dramatic moment of catharsis or a sudden revelation that heals all wounds. It's the daily choice to keep going, to keep trusting, to keep building a life worth living despite everything that's happened. Maria Santos taught me that evil can wear a kind face, but she also taught me something else, something I didn't expect, that I am stronger than I ever knew, strong enough to survive betrayal, strong enough to fight back, strong enough to stand in a courtroom and tell my story without breaking, and strong enough to write these words, to share my experience with anyone who needs to hear it, to say, this happened to me, and I'm still here. If you're reading this and you recognize something of your own life in my story, if someone you trust feels somehow wrong, if numbers don't add up and explanations don't quite make sense, please listen to that voice. It might be nothing, but it might be everything. Trust your instincts, ask questions, verify what you're told, and know that if the worst has already happened, if you're already a victim, there is a path forward. Justice is possible. Recovery is possible. Life, real life, is possible. I know because I'm living it. The maid who became my enemy is locked away now, paying for her crimes. The money she stole, most of it, is gone forever. The trust she destroyed is still being rebuilt, piece by careful piece. But I am free. I am healed. I am whole. And that is a victory she can never take from me.